What's the Jewish claim to Israel? Take a look at this clip from Ron Dermer, who's talking on the Jordan Peterson show about the Jewish claim. He lays out the moral argument, the international law argument, and the historical argument as to what the Jewish claim is to the land of Israel. So watch this clip together and then talk about it. But first, hit that subscribe button over there in the corner. We'd love to stay in touch. Check this out.
I've always thought that the Palestine-Israel conflict was just a bit too convenient for many major players in the region, partly because it could be used as a scapegoat and partly because support for the Palestinians caused a certain amount of intractable and continual trouble that did, this is the moral hazard argument, that did detract people from other sources of unrest and instability and corruption. Obviously, the Palestinians are backed by external players who are, I think it's obvious, who are capitalizing on that conflict for their own purposes. And so, in whose interest do you think it is primarily in the Middle East to foster and facilitate a continuing non-peaceful standoff between the Palestinians and the Israelis?
So the first is the Palestinians themselves, because they've been dining out on this conflict now since Oslo, really for 30 years, and becoming the wards of the international community. I'd say the Middle East is incredibly complicated. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, much less so, in my view. The reason why you have a conflict today is the same reason why you had a conflict for the last century, which is the refusal of the Palestinians to recognize the legitimacy of a nation state of the Jewish people in any boundary in our ancestral homeland. They refuse to do it. It's very simple and almost raw. In their minds, we stole their house. And that's how they see it. They don't understand that this is the territory, where the patriarchs of the Jewish people prayed or where our prophets preached and our kings rule. It's a complete denial of any historical connection between the Jews and the land of Israel. Their refusal to accept some sort of compromise. The fact that they haven't paid such a huge price for that refusal because they've been supported by various actors in the region for a long time. And actually, the Abraham Accords is like the beginning of a shift away. It's the removal of the Palestinians' veto over this process, and the Arab leaders, for their own interests, which we discussed before, security and economic interests, understand we're not going to give the keys to the Middle East to the person who's effectively the mayor of Ramallah, the leader of the Palestinian Authority. Because Palestinian politics are divided. You have Hamas, which is a terror organization that openly calls to destroy Israel, leading Gaza, which is half of the Palestinian polity. Then on the other half, you have this Palestinian Authority, which refuses to confront the terrorists and also make sure that the next generation is fired by the same hatred and denial of any Israel's legitimate presence in the land, because they do it through their schools and their media and everything else. And they also pay people, actually. They put them on the payroll, those who are terrorists. So the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a pretty simple one.
Okay, so let me ask you a question about that. This is something that's bothered me for a very long time, and I think it's key to this in some sense. So let me set up an analogy, and it's a dangerous analogy, and it may be inappropriate, but I'm going to use it anyways. And so Constantinople is now Istanbul, but historically it wasn't. And so you could say in some sense that the Christians have a claim on Constantinople, and it's not like people haven't made that claim. And so I'm not saying they have a claim or that they don't. What I am saying is that when you look at a given region, you can look at it through the lens of different temporal durations. And the ethical conclusion that you derive is in some sense dependent on the expanse of the temporal horizon that you're willing to consider. Now, the argument you made for the legitimacy of the state of Israel is it's an ancient claim. And then that begs the question, and I think this really it's an extraordinarily difficult question. How do you know which temporal horizon should be most appropriately applied to a given landscape, especially given that there are different claims and different temporal frames of reference that are applied to the same territory of land by other people? And I mean, the same thing is true, say, in North America, because the Europeans came in, and obviously there were people living here before the Europeans came in. And so it's an endless conflict in Canada, let's say, and the US about to what degree the people who inhabited the territory originally have a valid moral claim on the territory. And it's not like that's been resolved. I don't think we know how to resolve it. And then with the Jews, you seem to have this additional insistence by the world that they solve it better than anyone else. And again, that has something to do with, to those to whom more has been given, more will be demanded. The Jews seem to be held consistently to a higher moral standard, but it is a real problem. Why do you think the Palestinians should, both ethically and practically, accept the claim of the Israel state and to exist and the Jews to inhabit it? Because that really is the central issue.
The thing with your analogy, in the issue of sort of the New World, we're the Indians who came back. In the case of Constantinople, you'd have the Christians who would come back, and they would have had to have lived there continuously and then established a state, and then the Muslim power says, no, you have no right to be here. Like, no one would question if the Native Americans somehow, and this is not the case with most peoples were lost to history when they lost their land. Now, the Jews lived continuously, a small Jewish community lived continuously for over 3,000 years in the land of Israel, but Jews were dispersed all over the world and they came back. No one has ever dealt with that, where people coming back. But when you're talking about legitimacy, there's a historical legitimacy here where we are in our ancestral homeland that doesn't exist anywhere else. It's not displacing the natives. The Jews were the ones who were displaced, not just by the Romans, but also by the Arab conquest, where a lot of Jews were. People just don't know history. I mean, most people's sense of history, as you know, goes back to breakfast. So why should anybody care about what happened? But if those historical claims don't work for you, well, you could take the legal claim. And the legal claim was that there was an Ottoman Empire here. The Ottoman Empire collapsed. The British were given a mandate to control this territory, specifically by the League of Nations, in order to enable the settlement of the Jews, who in the 19th century, the late 19th century, the Spring of Nations, were considered a people. You know, there are people who don't consider the Jews a people, but we have a 4,000-year history and peoples have rights of self-determination. And so the British were given a mandate by then the League of Nations, which folded into the United Nations, to actually affect the settlement of that territory, to enable the Jews to establish this homeland there. That's the legal case is rock solid. The historical case is rock solid. And to me, the moral case is rock solid. Because we're a people that the entire world turned their backs on the Jews anytime we were oppressed. I mean, Jews would have a right to a state anywhere. But to say that the Jews don't have a right to a state in their ancestral homeland, that seems to me lunacy. Now, there are people who say no people have a right to a state. So those people who deny Israel's right to exist, that they should be no nation states, well, I wouldn't call them being I wouldn't say they're anti-Semitic. One of the measures of anti-Semitism is, are you treating Jews to a different standard than you're treating other people? So if you believe any people have a right to a state, that there is such a thing as a people, and what makes a people, it can be language, it can be a common culture, it can be a common history, right? The one thing that the Jews were missing historically is they didn't have the same land, but all the elements of peoplehood they had. So if you're going to look around the world, and you're going to say peoples deserve states. But for some reason, the Jews, who their statelessness has caused more oppression and persecution than against any other people in history, at least any other people that currently exist. And, you have pogroms, and you culminate it, because everyone is focused on the Holocaust, which I think the Holocaust has, in a certain sense, distorted our view of anti-Semitism in Jewish history. Because it is such a blinding event that happened. 18 million Jews, 6 million are wiped out. It's a third of the Jewish people, the equivalent of 100 million Americans or over 10 million Canadians, huge numbers of people. And I used to, when I was ambassador to the United States, to explain what the Holocaust did to the Jews, I would tell Americans, if you can't wrap your mind around 100 million people, imagine a 9/11 every day for a century. That's what the Holocaust did to the Jewish people. So it is such a seismic event that people don't recognize all the anti-Semitism that came before it, all the centuries of anti-Semitism that came before. People who killed 200,000 Jews, 400,000 Jews. The Jews are expelled from England, and then they're expelled from France, and they're expelled from Spain, and they're expelled from Portugal. All the persecutions, all the pogroms, all the massacres during the Crusades, before the Crusades, in antiquity, in present day, you're sitting, I understand, in England. Well, they just discovered up in Norwich a well. I don't know if you had a chance to read that story, where they have a bunch of skeletons that they found at the bottom of a well. And they dated those skeletons to the 12th century, to the end of the 12th century, when there was a pogrom against the local Jewish community. So anti-Semitism has existed century after century to century, and it's a big subject that we could maybe tackle in the future. But for me, the bottom line is to make a case where the Jewish people are not by right entitled to a state is absurd. And the fact that somebody would deny it in our own homeland is the height of absurdity.
Let me ask you one more question on the Palestinian front then. So you've made a case, I would say, globally and abstractly, and this is not a criticism of the case precisely, that nationhood, it's reasonable to associate nationhood with the necessity of a state. And then you made a case that the Jews have a legal right to the land they occupy as a consequence of what occurred after World War I, a strong legal case. And so then I would say, let's particularize that for a minute. And perhaps if I was arguing the Palestinian case, I would say, yes, but it wasn't reasonable for the world to purchase what was just and appropriate to deliver to the Jews at disproportionate cost to the Palestinians.
Yeah, but Jordan, the world didn't do that. The Jews did that. The Jews came and immigrated in larger numbers. There was a trickle of immigration of the Jews over the centuries to be in the land of Israel, in the Holy Land. But in the late 19th century, with the birth of modern Zionism, and actually Christian Zionism came about 3 or 4 decades even before that, and maybe even further than that in the late 18th century and the 19th century, the Jews came back, settled the lands, drained the swamps, purchased it, a lot of times from Arab landowners who weren't even present, who would sell it. And the Ottoman Empire collapses. So now the question is, who does this land that you have legal deed to, who does it belong to? And instead of actually having a Palestinian national movement, and this is really their great tragedy, they didn't have a Palestinian national movement 100 years ago, and they don't have it today, who says, look, guys, you have a right to be here, but we have a right to be here. You know, if that's the case, you're in a negotiation. When somebody says you stole our house, even if you give 99.9% back, there's no justice to your claim. When another side says it's 1% yours by right, not just by might, but by right, and it's 99% ours, you're actually in a negotiation. And the reason why, you have to ask yourself, why did the Palestinians deny history? So Arafat went to Clinton at Camp David. Yasser Arafat, the leader of the Palestinians at the time, 20 years ago, goes to Camp David and tells Clinton, there was never a temple on the Temple Mount. Like, why does he say that? And why do they deny any Jewish connection to Jerusalem? It's like you hear the current Palestinian leader, Abu Mazen, says, the Jews are trying to Judeify Jerusalem. You know, that's like saying the Chinese are trying to Sinify Beijing, or the Russians Russifying Moscow. I mean, it's ridiculous. But why do they do that? Because the entire scaffolding of their rejectionism collapses if we have a legitimate claim to that territory. They don't have to deny their claim, but they can't make themselves take that one step, which is by far, that would be a very small step for a leader, but a giant leap towards peace. The second they say that we, the Jews, have a right to be in the land of the patriarchs, the prophets, and the kings, then we're in a negotiation. Then we have to work out a settlement. But they refuse to cross the Rubicon.
There's a lot of interesting points that he brings up over here, and these are some of the classic points and arguments that are used to justify the Jewish presence in the land of Israel. There's the historical argument, there's the international law argument, and there's the moral argument, the anti-Semitism argument that the Jews needed a place to go. There is one area that he kind of leaves out over here, and is perhaps the most powerful, especially for those that are believers in the Bible, and that is the biblical or divine argument, that this is the land that God promised to the Jewish people in the Bible repeatedly. Abraham is brought to Israel in what would be modern-day Judea, Samaria area, and he's promised this land on multiple occasions for him and his descendants. They later promised to Isaac, and from Isaac it's promised to Jacob. And Jacob, all throughout the patriarchs, the frame of reference is that your nation, you're the people that come from you, are going to spend time in Egypt, and they're going to be enslaved. And after the enslavement, I'm going to bring them back to this land, saying that it's this specific nation, this specific people that is guaranteed this land forever and ever. And this is one of the reasons why in Jewish law, Jewish history, Jewish practice, that Israel has had throughout the centuries, right? Whether we're talking about 500,000, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, wherever the Jews were on planet Earth, their heart was facing towards the Holy Land. In the book of Daniel, when Daniel has the decree against him, he goes up to his room and he faces Jerusalem. He's not in Jerusalem at the time. He's not in Israel at the time. He faces Jerusalem because he's looking towards that center that God had promised, that he knew that God had promised forever and ever. And wherever Jews find themselves throughout the world, they will face Jerusalem. They have been, not just now, not just since 1948, 200, 500, 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, wherever they were, wherever they're praying, they're directed towards Jerusalem. Everything that we do is always remembering Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple and the anticipation of being gathered back to our land. Every person who sits under every husband and wife, bride and groom that stand under the chuppah, when the groom breaks the glass, what's the purpose of breaking up the glass? To symbolize the destruction, that even on the happiest moment of your life, on your wedding day, that you still remember the destruction of Jerusalem and the yearning to return there. We pray every day, 3 times a day in our prayers, return us to Israel, return us to Jerusalem. To say that Israel or Jerusalem does not have a Jewish connection, as is the fable that is publicized by the other side, as Ron Dermer mentions over here, is not only ahistoric, it's completely out of the realm of reality. It's completely detached from any sense of reality. And the only way to really affirm the relationship that the Jewish people have with the land of Israel is to go back to that promise that God gives to Abraham in the Bible, that this is promised to you and your descendants forever. If you like this content overall, hit that subscribe button over there in the corner. We'd love to stay in touch. Take care.